We want to talk about Gordon Brown and his foreign policy tonight, and I just thought I'd lay out one or two thoughts before I introduce the panel. Gordon Brown came promising change in everything, as we know, and there are many questions, though, over whether there has been real change in foreign policy. We know very little about Gordon Brown and foreign policy. He's not done abroad previously. He trebled international development spending. He was central in the Commission for Africa process. We know that that informs his Christian socialism. But he's never really featured in the international side at all. Domestic policy has been his strongest point. So what can we look at since he's become Prime Minister? He's put the world's most senior civil servant, who's British, Mark Malloch Brown, who was Deputy Secretary General of the UN, in as a Foreign Office Minister. And Mark, if any of you know him, is someone who is an extremely able communicator, and in the last couple of years has made his feelings about America extending its military power in the world extremely clear. In a newspaper interview recently, he said, "I am very much not a neocon." So that points us in one direction. And at the same time, Douglas Alexander has gone to the Department for International Development, who's a Brownite to his fingertips, a department that's doubled the number of its ministers, and he talks in an interview that was spun to me as being very significant about multilateralism and soft power being the way that Britain would project itself in the future. Although this at the same time enabled David Miliband, another contender for the next generation of Labour leadership, to say entirely the opposite in a television interview and say nothing's changed. So what does David Miliband think? He did a speech last week, and I'd just like to pick out two things from it. One sentence: our objective in the world is not domination. It is not to force others to live as we do, which certainly seemed to be a slightly different emphasis to some of the things we've seen recently. And a second thing from David Miliband's speech last week, he emphasised the responsibility to protect, which is talking about citizens in the world who are not looked after by their own governments, and that ultimately could mean very significant military intervention beyond state borders if the world is really serious about what is now known in the jargon as R2P. On the panel tonight, from right to left, but not really in that significance. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, Conservative MP for Kensington and Chelsea, former Foreign and Defence Secretary, and I will declare his interest if he doesn't. He's a non-executive chairman of a very large security company which does a lot of business in Iraq, Armour Group. So, although he's a strong supporter into an inquiry about the Iraq war, he's certainly done very nicely out of it so far. Gisela Stewart, MP, is on the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, a strong supporter of the Iraq war at the beginning, and now somebody who can talk about what the Labour Party really will do from inside. At the far end, General Sir Mike Jackson, retired as Britain's...
Not on the far left, let me be quite clear.
He can speak for himself, but I hope he will. Britain's most senior army officer, retired last year, and has since then spoken his mind about the febrile atmosphere of Whitehall and the way that he believes the MOD has let down our armed forces. He's got a book coming out in a couple of months, and has constantly, when he stood on this platform and other platforms recently, sworn not to divulge any of the secrets in that book, but surely it's not quite Harry Potter and the Seventh, the Dance of the Deathly Hallows, and we might get something out of him tonight that is...
still worth buying, though.
Next to me, the political editor of The Economist, Andrew Miller, very experienced in Russian affairs. That's something that will certainly come up tonight. And as political editor of The Economist, responsible for the Budget column, which, if those of you who don't know, is a sort of waspish take on Whitehall. Last week's Budget column, Richard, just to start with you, Andrew, to start with you, you were arguing that not much has changed, really, particularly in terms of Britain's relationship with the United States. Could you expand on that?
Well, I think in some respects the special relationship is obviously going to be different. I think if there's one thing that Gordon Brown is not going to have to do, it's go to war in Iraq alongside George Bush. But if you'd asked Tony Blair whether he was going to do that in 1997, he wouldn't have thought it was very likely either. So circumstances are going to be different, and Gordon Brown, if he's still Prime Minister at the beginning of 2009, is going to have to work with a new president, whoever that is, and his relationship with Bush and between now and then is going to be affected by that. But apart from those considerations, I do think that the relationship is going to be fundamentally the same as it is now, similar to it is now, for the following reason. I think Tony Blair had an answer to the basic question of British foreign policy, which was how best, as a post-imperial, medium-sized power, can we sort of project our influence in the world. And the answer was to be simultaneously as close as he could to America and as intimately involved in Europe as he could. Now, those two imperatives came into conflict in the course of his premiership and also rubbed up against public opinion. But I think Gordon Brown's answer is going to be more or less the same, maybe with some sort of changes of emphasis on both scores. But you talk about his sort of commitment, the things we do know about his foreign policy, his interest in alleviating poverty, debt, international development and so on, and he will know that the best way to further those goals is in alliance with the United States. So although we can't say the relationship will be identical to how it has been, I think he is well aware that of the necessity of maintaining that very strong relationship, as he's been saying and David Miliband was saying in the last few days.
Gisela, do you see change? I mean, we've been told by Gordon Brown there'll be change in everything. Is there change in foreign policy? Is that what you're hearing on the Labour backbenches?
Well, you've got to be realistic. Foreign policy is the one area where prime ministers may have high aspirations, but it's also the one area where whatever their predictions are, events overtake them, and it becomes very different. Tony Blair's foreign policy, if you'd asked him in '97, as you said, would not have been what it turned out to be. I think the number of key things, ones which are sort of substantial within the Labour Party, never ever underestimate the political significance of creating DFID. You've now got a department whose budget is 3 times as large as the Foreign Office. Second thing is the incredible increase in spending in the security. Without the microphone, are you okay?
Yeah. Speak up a little.
I'm not sure these are working.
Is that okay? Yeah. So, yeah, first of all is the creation of DFID, which was something which we did in '97, take out international development as a tool of foreign policy, which I think some politicians may, with hindsight, regret, the clear separation. Spending huge amounts of money in Africa, and yet as a continent which is becoming poorer all the time. The second thing is a rather peculiar situation that we've got Europe within the Foreign Office. If you've got a political aspiration that he wants to be at the heart of Europe, why is the Europe Minister negotiating domestic policy faced within the Foreign Office? Actually want to be within number 10. Security services, much greater spending. And I think the real telltales, irrespective of what they may want to do, are the recognitions in David Miliband's speech. One is where he quite clearly says that the distinction between foreign and national is becoming increasingly blurred. And you can't make that clear distinction anymore. I mean, just take one thing. What's been the Portuguese embassy, our embassy in Portugal, most occupied with, and what's the media been most occupied with over the last few months? The kidnapping of a British girl in Portugal. It's kind of complete blurring of that. And I think the second thing is, and again I think it's in the Miliband speech, is that we used to be worried about states having too much power, and that was a driving force of foreign policy. The problem we now have is with states which haven't got power because they've failed. And the question is, how do we work? And I think Gordon Brown, apart from his commitment to Africa, will also be quite clear of that our international institutions, which we require to solve these problems, actually aren't up to the job anymore. And that's why I think Malak Brown will be very interesting.
So Malcolm, you've served as Foreign Secretary and indeed as Defence Secretary as well. It's obviously a very different world from when you were there because of terrorism and because of Iraq and Afghanistan. But are there very different tools needed to deal with it? And does Gordon Brown, is he using the right ones?
Well, first of all, I'm going to slightly differ from both what you said and what Gisela said, which you both implied that Blair would not have chosen in '97 the way things worked out. Well, in one sense, that is, of course, obviously true. But, you know, the road to Baghdad began in Kosovo. Blair, as early as '97, '98, was talking about a foreign policy of positive interventionism, of preemptive conflicts, of using the military means to impose solutions on political problems. And what happened in Kosovo, although the details are very different, fundamentally was the same. We went to war with Serbia, although we had not been attacked. I'm not arguing at the moment whether it was right or wrong. I'm simply saying that is a very real precedent, long before George W. Bush appeared on the scene. Now, in terms of Gordon Brown's policy, you have to make a distinction between his domestic political requirements and his foreign policy. His domestic political requirements is to recognize that Blair has had a disastrous impact on his reputation, mainly as a result of Iraq, but also for a wider range of issues. Therefore, he has to appear different. But, and it's a very important but, first of all, Brown wasn't just a member of the government for the last 10 years. He was the second most powerful member of that government. The Iraq War couldn't have happened if Brown had refused to go along with it. So there are very severe limits on what Brown can distance himself from. Secondly, we have an unusual situation, not altogether a healthy situation, that neither the Prime Minister Gordon Brown nor the Foreign Secretary David Miliband have any experience of foreign policy up till now. And that's not a criticism, it's not their fault, but it happens to be a fact. And it's a relatively unusual situation that both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are on a learning curve. And because in Brown's case his experience has been entirely economic, and in Miliband's case environmental and related issues, that's why the speech that Miliband made last week, and much of what Gordon Brown has been saying, has talked about the importance of foreign policy of climate change and economic development, all of which are very worthy, but are actually a long way from the central issues of foreign policy. The third factor is, and we see this already in Miliband's speech, I looked carefully at that speech, you think of a domestic political need to distance yourself from Blair, but with the realities of not upsetting the United States. And when you look at Miliband's speech, it's a 12-page speech. It doesn't mention Iraq, the central issue of foreign policy, till page 10. On page 10 it says, there are certain areas where military intervention is justified. It mentions Kosovo as an example where military intervention is justified. It then goes on to say Darfur may be another example. It then says, in relation to Iraq, first time Iraq is mentioned, it never says the war was right or justified. It says we have international responsibilities which now must be honored. So by putting it in the same paragraph, there is an implication that that comes within the realm of justified military intervention. But Miliband is unable either to say it was wrong or to say it was right to have that war in the first place. And that says something. It says that the government is actually in a predicament. It has a domestic need to pretend that it's differentiating, so you appoint Malak Brown, you bring back John Denham, but the realities of the real world in which they're living have forbidden them to make the break with Washington that the domestic political imperative would want them to encourage them to make.
General, you've seen this from the beginning, from Kosovo 1998 to 9 and right through to Afghanistan and Iraq. Is this a different government from the one that you dealt with?
Well, I'm going to try and raise the debate. So far, we've had it all seen through a sub-tactical UK political party level. Well, I'm not sure that's good enough, because we're in some very difficult and dangerous, and I fear, enduring circumstances. The question of where any British Prime Minister positions him or herself, certainly since in the Second War, and I could argue in the 30s as well, is not a matter of personality or party. It's a matter of strategic imperative which flows from our geography and flows from our history. I've described this dilemma as rather like sitting on a fence, a cliche you will say, but in this case the fence has rather sharply honed points to it, and therefore sitting on the fence puts you in a delicate part of the anatomy and it becomes somewhat uncomfortable. But to jump one way or the other, which is sometimes how the argument appears to go, it's time Britain made up its mind whether it's European or Atlanticist, is to me a rather third form debate. We are where we are, we have the interests we have, and those interests overlap both with North America and with continental Europe. I'm not sure we do strategy very well in this country. DFID was just being quoted as its inauguration in '99 with its Act of Parliament, which was its birth certificate and gave it its mission to relieve poverty, full stop. Very noble, very ideal. And yet Britain has put itself on a strategic course by, I would argue, force of circumstances, events, dear boy, events, where what requires of this government, when I say this, I mean this British, whoever it may be, I didn't make no party political point there at all, to be able to pursue a strategy, bringing together all sinews of government, heading to one objective. There is not room, in my view, for Whitehall rivalry. Neither is there room in Washington for Beltway rivalry, but there's more of that even than we have to put up with it. So this ability to act as one, I think, is absolutely vital to this country, whatever course we are pursuing. And my last point, I think, at this stage would be the contrast between so-called soft, so-called hard power is a matter which is very important. Without doubt, soft power is preferable to hard. But when, as I fear we are, we don't like talking about it because it's a bit hard, but when we are facing some opponents for whom reason and what we understand by normal politics and rationality are as of nothing, you can't avoid having to think about, and from time to time, reluctantly I dare say, use hard power as well.
Can I, if you'll forgive me, before we go into the realms that you're taking us, just go back to the quotidian nature of domestic politics, because Sir Malcolm talked about the inexperience in foreign affairs of this government, and I wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Well, there's an extraordinary experience of foreign affairs amongst the whole of Parliament.
I think there's quite an extraordinary experience of foreign affairs across the whole of Parliament, and it's probably gone back since about the early 90s, when the Tories were trying to hold on to power and we were trying to win the election, and there were no votes abroad, essentially. And I think the quality of foreign affairs debates, other than the very specialised select committees, I think is rather limited. And the best input, rather strangely, the political input you get is from those politicians who have actually served in the forces.
Not enough of them, I fear.
But they bring a realism to that. But I think some of the debates have changed. I mean, for example, I think one of the things which Gordon Brown will have to face up to as a foreign policy issue is security of energy supply. And it requires energy. And it requires a combination of expertise, which I think our current politicians aren't very good at. And that's where I think Whitehall becomes very important. That's where I think the Foreign Office as an institution has now an extraordinary chance to reassert itself, which it really shouldn't miss.
Can I just add to something that Gisela said there? Because the reality, I think, at the moment is that there isn't any significant party political divide on foreign policy. But, and it's an important but, there are deep and passionate divisions within each party on the very issues that we're likely to be discussing this evening. So that when we are discussing Iraq, passionate supporters either of the war or against the war in both parties. When we're discussing the future of the European Union, passionate supporters of greater integration or Euroscepticism in both parties. On the Middle East issues, supporters of Israel, supporters of the Palestinians, but not divided on a party political basis. So the debates on foreign policy, I actually disagree with you, Gisela. I think there are some superb contributions, but they're not party contributions. They're individuals.
But there are a lot of party political points made. I mean, for example, you're a very strong supporter of an inquiry into the Iraq war.
Yes.
That's just playing politics, isn't it? Because you're not going to... how is an inquiry into how the war happened going to stop bombing in Baghdad?
No, you cannot have the greatest British foreign policy disaster since Munich and say that until every single British soldier has left Iraq, we cannot actually investigate what went wrong. I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, the government themselves have been forced to acknowledge that an inquiry will be necessary. The debate is purely about timing. The government say, we cannot have it while British troops are in Iraq. That's absurd. The Gallipoli Commission, one of the most important in our history, took place while the First World War was still going on. We didn't say, let's wait till the Germans have been, or the Turks have been defeated before we can actually investigate.
Would you agree with General Sir Mike that that understanding of strategy is pretty low in the political class?
Depends what you mean by strategy. If we're talking about military strategy, we look... When I was Defence Secretary, I didn't pretend to be an expert on military tactics or military strategy. I looked to Mike and to his colleagues to advise me on that. But there is always, on these issues, a geopolitical dimension. Yeah. The army are there to... the Ministry of Defence and the Armed Forces are the handmaiden of foreign policy, not the other way around. They are there to meet the requirements of a country's foreign policy. So the foreign policy strategic objectives, I think, are understood. How you deliver these objectives, if they require a military dimension, there we look to the military professionals to advise us.
I just rather unfashionably want to agree with something that you said and with something that Mike said, which is this question of, it relates to the question of inexperience. I think you're right. Every time Gordon Brown has hitherto talked about the problems of Afghanistan, Iraq, terror and Israel-Palestine, he seems to view them almost exclusively through an economic prism. So if there were more sort of parity between GDP per capita in Israel and Palestine, things would be better. If there were better economic development in Afghanistan, the situation would clear up.
My whole point about strategy, or the lack of it.
Right. Well, and I think there's something in that way of looking at the world. And arguably, it's a less dangerous way of looking at the world than what eventually seemed to be Tony Blair's rather Manichaean way of doing so. But it is, for the reasons that Mike said, a very limited way of looking at the world when we're dealing with the sort of fanatical enemies which in some cases we are. So I hope that he talks in that way for the reasons that you say, which are, that's the way he's been accustomed to looking at problems of policy that he's had to resolve, and that he will have a slightly broader, more imaginative way of looking at them in the future.
So his response to a problem would be not so idealistic and moving towards getting Mike to get the tanks out of the garage the first time that a problem emerges.
I didn't say that. I think his economic approach is itself idealistic. Gordon Brown dislikes poverty, whether it's here or elsewhere, and he believes that if you address it, then things will get better. And that's not completely wrong. I think his inclination to use hard power would be relatively low because of the events of the last 10 years, as indeed would Tony Blair's be if he was still Prime Minister. But he may have to, for the reasons Mike says.
But just as a coda, it seems to me from what we know, which is not a great deal perhaps, that many of the perpetrators of terrorism on behalf of such people as Al-Qaeda are not relatively economically deprived. They come from backgrounds which actually deny that. And so buying them off is not an option. Sorry.
One additional point. I mean, all prime ministers are on a learning curve. From the moment they become either leader of their party or prime minister. When Margaret Thatcher first became leader of the opposition, she knew very little about foreign policy. Somebody once asked a parliamentary colleague of mine, how much did Margaret Thatcher, as leader of the opposition, know about foreign policy? And not realizing he was speaking to a journalist, that my colleague replied, she knows so little about foreign policy that she thinks that Sinai is the plural of sinus. At the time it was probably true. It quickly ceased to be true.
She learnt.
There is, though, a very different feel. There's a very different feel to me. I travelled a lot in Kosovo in 1998 before the NATO intervention, and it felt to me, and to other European journalists who were there, that Tony Blair was engineering things to the point that he wanted military intervention at some point. I mean, I put that slightly too strongly, perhaps, but there were cartoons in German newspapers of European leaders cowering in the trenches and Blair going over the top with his Tommy helmet and his bayonet. And certainly every single one of those massacres during the summer and autumn of 1998, which we put on the 9 o'clock news. I was working then with Vaughan Smith, now the owner of this club, as a cameraman, had a far more prominence and significance in media terms, in terms of the way that they influenced politics and the UN, because Britain was wanting to move towards motions that moved towards a conflict. I saw Tony Blair as someone who thought that Labour had been seen to be soft on defence, and he didn't want it to happen on his watch. There's a very different feel now, and of course it's because the world is much more complicated. We have doctors in Glasgow wanting to blow themselves up, and there's no point in making countries richer in order to prevent that. But it is still a different kind of world that politicians are inhabiting in terms of their desire to go to war, it feels to me. Mike, I don't know if you...
Well, it's very complex. You know, Kosovo has now come up several times in this debate. I don't think there was any other way of dealing with Milosevic and what he was about to do, I think, to the Albanian Kosovars, other than military action. There had been so many attempts to achieve some form of diplomatic stroke political resolution, all of which, at the end of the day, he wriggled away from. So at that point, you have got a rather stark choice. You either say, okay, do whatever you're going to do, and we're going to back off at this point, or you say, I'm very sorry, we have given you a very clear direction as to what is acceptable in Europe, which it was, and so the choice, as I say, was very stark at that point. Now, whether you agree or not agree with the fact that the then Prime Minister decided to take the lead, which he did, in galvanizing the West, if I can put that in inverted commas, to deal with Milosevic, you can agree or disagree. But the fact is, I think, come early 99, there was only two choices. One was to back off, the other was to not appear to be a paper tiger, which was, I think, what would have happened had we not done what happened.
We talked a lot at the beginning of this about military intervention possibilities and Iraq. I want, before I open this up to the floor, just to rattle through a few other foreign policy objectives and events and things, just to nudge them, starting with energy policies already been raised, and Russia, of course, being a potential big problem or enemy or partner, depending on how we play it. Andrew, you spent a lot of time in Russia. The Miliband response to the Litvinenko affair was his first big sort of foreign policy push. How did he do?
I think he did pretty well, although I think the change of government was basically neutral on how they responded to the Litvinenko affair. I think the government, reading between the lines, A, were disappointed in the lack of Russian cooperation, and B, had probably come to the conclusion that there was some state-level involvement in the murder, and that therefore they'd take make some kind of punitive gesture, which they did. I think they were right. They were right to do that, and I think importantly, it's a sort of first time in British policy towards Russia in recent years where national interests have taken precedence over business interests, because a lot of people in the British business community, which has, many of whom have large interests in investments in Russia, were very energetically urging the diplomats to hush it up, and many of the diplomats were praying that the police inquiry wouldn't go very far. And in the end, I think they did the right thing, and it's a sort of a turning point, although not a very dramatic one, in Western policy towards Russia.
If Russia does, again, this winter, what it did last winter, and turns off the taps to politically inconvenient people, does anyone on the panel think that Britain should take a stronger line than it did before?
Well, I mean, I have to declare an interest, because before Miliband, I was the last British Foreign Secretary to throw out Russian diplomats from the Russian embassy in London in 1996. And I think what Miliband did was right. I agree with what has just been said, and particularly for the reason that you hinted on, that it wasn't just Lugovoy as an individual who was being charged. What British ministers were unable to say, because there is no hard evidence, is that if Lugovoy, as a former KGB agent, had access to polonium and carried out this, if he did carry this out, then somebody further up the Kremlin chain of command must have encouraged him to do so. I say no more than that. And therefore there was a much more fundamental issue at stake. Now, you've broadened the discussion to energy policy and if Russia flexes its muscles. It's more of a problem at the end of the day for Germany than it is for Britain. At the moment, we're not that dependent on Russian gas. But the German government in particular, because of the very close links it's developed, particularly with Schröder and Putin, has to come to a judgment on two things. First of all, is Western Europe going to become a hostage to the unpredictable vagaries of Russian policy? Secondly, is there going to be any prospect of developing a European energy policy? Because if there is going to be a European energy policy, it cannot be the present Schroeder-Putin relationship. It has to be something where Russia is not so
sitting
closely
uncomfortably
involved.
as we do on with the soft part of our anatomy, with spikes coming up on this fence between Europe and America that Mike so graphically described. Gisela, I mean, if Germany has problems, we have problems too. We're part of more than just a trading alliance.
But also what was quite interesting on energy, this so-called European unity, when push came to shove, national interests suddenly made their amazing resurgence, you know, and they all signed their bilateral agreements. So let's not be fooled here. But let's look at the map slightly differently. You know, it's not about Europe. Just look at Azerbaijan. Just look at the pipelines which are being built there. If you really want security of energy supply, we've actually got to secure those much more carefully. Look at what BP is doing. And I think one of the things which we haven't addressed, we keep talking about foreign policy in the old way. Who actually makes foreign policy these days? Where does the advice from to what extent would a Downing Street rely on the foreign policy advice from the Foreign Office? Just look at the non-traditional players. BP is much more important what he does in Baku at the moment in its pipelines than any foreign policy advisor. Just look at Bill Gates and those private foundations who have got enormous influence, and those big players. And I think the question is much more, where is foreign policy made these days? And I think the answer is it is no longer made in the institutions we traditionally look to.
Can I just stick on Europe? And one of Europe's upcoming challenges, problems, is Turkey. Do you think Turkey should join the European Union, Mike?
That's a political question which I will leave.
We are no longer.
The military have quite a role in Turkey.
Well,
President Jackson.
if I may, I'd like to pick that up and just reflect, just for a moment, before you move on to Turkey. This whole question of the incident with Russia, it is about the rule of law. And if we lose sight of that as a bedrock of a mature Western democracy, we're done for. As I've seen, and many, as I, heaven's sake, most of the audience have seen, probably more graphically than I have, what happens when the rule of law goes out of the window, if it was ever there in the first place. You get an anarchical situation. And so, very much, we did the right thing, without doubt. I won't bang on about energy, always a bit of a... but to read that across to the rule of law to Turkey, if Turkey wishes to be a member of the European Union, and it meets those criteria which are required for membership, I cannot think, under the rule of law, such as it is in the European environment, that it should not be allowed to join.
In the big strategic question, it's a friendly Muslim country, and we could...
Well, that was, it seems to me, very much what the last election was about. Again, many people in this room probably know Turkey a lot better than I do, but one's abiding impression of Turkey is the reverence with which Kemal Atatürk is held, because of the legacy which he left Turkey, which was of a secular country. And a secular democracy at that. And the worrying aspect is the degree to which that non-secular approach is now being challenged one way and another. A non-secular Turkey would have no place in the EU, that is very clear.
on the other major international challenges, China, India, Brazil, huge economies emerging out of nowhere, are we ready to respond properly? David Miliband talked about Britain being a very open country and a very well-educated country as being one of the key things that we need in order to deal with this entirely different economy that we're in. But they're coming, aren't they?
And I actually really think that the most interesting one is India. And it comes back because it has the rule of law. It actually has democracy. And I think it has also got much a stable demography. If you look and compare to with China. But we need to learn to deal with China because it's our major trading partner. If anything goes wrong there. And just to slightly change, if you look at China's foreign policy, it's actually incredibly clear. You look at the map of where they need the resources in the world, and that is their foreign policy. It is the acquisition of the raw materials it requires. And if there's a kind of criticism of British governments almost for the last 50 years, is that there hasn't really been a statement of how we define British interests.
Is this including the government over the last 10 years?
Yeah, I think so. I think we've been less, but we probably have been clearer in terms that we've put human rights in a much more central position, and in defence of that have done things. But I think most European countries are suffering from not having clear statements of what their national interests are.
China certainly follows the Palmerstonian desire to have only permanent interests in terms of pursuing their energy policy absolutely to the end. Malcolm, I just want to come back, before we open this up to the audience, to something you said much earlier on, which is that the David Miliband speech was about a whole lot of things that aren't foreign policy, including climate change. I wonder whether climate change isn't the biggest foreign policy challenge that this country's ever faced.
Okay, I'll answer that. Can I just say something about China first? I mean, I don't think we've yet come to terms with the fact that with the growth of China and India, we are going to see, but over a considerable period of time, the most extraordinary historic change for 300 years. Since about 1700, the world has been controlled by the European powers and then latterly by the United States with a similar culture and with a similar values. So Europe has been the center of the world. North America was part of that civilization. Now we're seeing gradually two major new powers from the Far East with a different historic background. The caveat is that is not happening as quickly as people sometimes imply, because for at least another generation, China and India are going to be overwhelmingly preoccupied with their own domestic economic growth and with their ability to actually create within their own borders modern, viable states. But we should assume that over a generational period, the world is going to be a very different place. On the question of climate change, I don't question for a moment climate change is a massive global issue. But I think we should get away from using it as a soft option, as an alternative foreign policy. It's not foreign policy. Climate change is terribly important, but so are a lot of other things. We don't pretend that they're foreign policy. Of course there will be a need for countries to agree major ways of determining their relationship to actually control carbon emissions. Just as on trade policy, the World Trade Organization and member states, including the European Union, have to try and work out ways in which we can move towards free trade or some trading relationship. But foreign policy, if it means anything, is how you reconcile the difference of fundamental national interests that could lead to military conflict, that could lead to war, that could lead to massive loss of life because of conflict. That's ultimately what foreign policy is
the potential vast movement of people from Africa who can no longer sustain their lives where they are, won't that be a military challenge?
Well, it could turn out to be, but that's only in a very limited sense because of climate change. It is mainly because we have, for the first time in the history of the world, a combination of massive inequalities of standard of living combined with, because of television and the internet, an awareness amongst the poor parts of the world of how other parts of the world do not share their poverty, and with a capacity to travel that enables mass migration to be possible in a way that it was not possible except for the wealthy until 100 years ago.
Your very first intervention, you said you wanted to raise the tone of the discussion. I mean, this is absolutely
we are now doing better.
This is absolutely
and in fact, I'm going to, if I can just pick up that theme, and I'm going to go back to energy. It's not often that I necessarily will look across the channel for, and give plaudits. But France derives now some 80% of its domestic electric consumption, indeed it sells us some, from nuclear energy. Why on earth we cannot be clearer in this country? Let me put the question another way. In 100 years' time, what will be the sources of electricity in this country on the assumption we've still got it? Rather less than half will be renewables, rather more than half will be nuclear. It seems to me that is self-evident. And so we just need to, I think, get our minds round where the strategic interest lies, rather than, you know, if you live near Sellafield, does your hair fall out? Mine did a long time ago, even though I didn't. And all of that, because these are, you know, and you look at the casualty statistics of nuclear versus any other means of power, and enough said, although not all, I dare say, will agree with me. Then as to China and India, yes, here they are, these two embryo giants. Interestingly enough, DFID spend more money in China by double, more than double, than any other country. So, did I say China? Forgive me. India. Forgive me. India. Because there's lots of poverty in India. There's lots of poverty in China. This goes back to strategy. Who decides where DFID put their spending priorities? I have no idea. I've been on their website. Can't find an answer. What I do know is the numbers. And it's just intriguing as to whether we're thinking it through. Where is the real poverty? It is in Africa, without a shadow of doubt. Why is it? Because most African countries, sadly, the rule of law is nowhere. And so we should be starting by building institutions, by building that rule of law, perhaps for the long-term benefit, rather than putting sticking plaster on. Or we're actually helping people who are going to be in 20 years' time very, very capable of helping themselves.
Just pick up a couple of those things. On the question of Turkey, and with respect to Mike, it's true that an Islamist, a strongly Islamist Turkey would have no place in the European Union, but neither would a Turkey in which the army gets to choose who the government is.
Right.
And at the moment...
The avoidance of doubt, I have no truck with that whatsoever.
No, I didn't say you did.
I've said enough about it.
I didn't say you did. But I think the current debate about Turkey is influenced too much by fears about what its current government might do rather than what they actually have done. On the question of energy supply, Azerbaijan, I'm afraid, a place which I've spent a lot of time in and know quite well, is in fact a marginal consideration in global energy supply, precisely because most of the gas and oil in the Caspian is on the other side of the Caspian, and the Russians have quite successfully tied it all up through backhand deals with the Turkmens and the Kazakhs. And Europe does urgently need a united energy policy towards Russia, because the Russians basically view the world as respectable, serious countries like Britain and Germany, and non-serious, not proper countries such as Ukraine and Belarus, which it's permissible for them to mess around with, turn off the gas supplies to, and so on, which unfortunately, as we saw 2 winters ago, as you mentioned, has very serious consequences potentially for those countries on the other side of Europe. So we urgently need to address that. And in conclusion, I'd like to just say, maybe just to sort of strike a note of optimism. So a lot of this conversation has been about how screwed we are, how strategically complicated the situation is, and how our position in the world has weakened because of the various conflicts we've been involved in. But I think Gordon Brown's strategic inheritance, actually, from Tony Blair, isn't all that bad. It's actually, in some respects, quite good. I think Iraq is a catastrophe, and we are much less popular in some important parts of the world than we used to be, and more vulnerable to terrorism. But if you look at our two most important relationships, or the government no longer describes our relationship with Europe as a relationship, it's an alliance. You know, we're in a good position in Europe, in fact. The perfidious British plot to enlarge Europe and get in lots of other countries that agree with us and slow the pace of reform, and if we can't opt out of it, has more or less worked.
It's rather successful.
Has worked. And we are in credit in the White House, maybe for reasons which not all of us think are good reasons. But we are, and that will be important for whatever we wish to achieve, either in terms of security or in terms of soft power. So let's not be too depressed.
Several interventions ago, I said we might take some questions, and if I could move the microphone around, if you could say who you are, one down at the front here, and if you are affiliated to any organisation, then please tell us which one it is.
Hello, my name is Bobby Pathak. I'm a freelance journalist and a documentary maker. I have two very quick questions, if that's all right. They are open to everyone in the panel, but primarily I'm interested in General Sir Mike Jackson's. First off, seeing as you are General Sir Richard Dannant's predecessor, I'm curious to know what you make of the idea that the United Kingdom has almost run out of troops to defend the country or fight abroad. And this was in Saturday's Telegraph, but in other newspapers as well. And the other quick question is the idea that our current Defence Secretary, Des Brown, has the additional role of Scottish Secretary. Is there enough room to have a Defence Secretary having other responsibilities?
That might be one for Sir Malcolm. A very quick answer on that one.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have lots of criticisms of Des Brown, but that's not one of them. Since devolution, the job of Scottish Secretary is very, very minor. When Helen Little did the job, she had time to do French lessons because she had nothing else to do. So basically what the government needs is an occasional advisor when some non-devolved issue of Scottish policy comes before the Cabinet.
Well, General, what does soldiers think of having a part-time Defence Secretary?
What Malcolm has said may be a true reflection of the factual responsibility laid upon the Secretary of State for Scotland under devolution. However, the message which this decision sent to the armed forces, your armed forces, who are working pretty hard at the moment, and dare I say particularly the Army, that this was a moment to have what will be seen and is seen as a part-time Defence Secretary was very badly judged in my view.
And are you running out of troops?
Well, we seem to be helping the good burghers of Tewkesbury, so we're okay so far.
But the leak at the weekend was pretty strong.
Yeah, it was 6 weeks old, even though the Telegraph played it as though it was yesterday. This is a game that's going on. We've got a comprehensive spending review decision coming up. We all know the tactics of this game.
Political.
What? Well, it is.
One here in the front.
How you spend your money is entirely political. But we who receive it make a judgment as to what you think of us by what you give us.
One here at the front first.
My name is Yektu.
Just hold it very close.
My name is Yektu Gulbaran. I am Kurdish from Turkey. We just described Turkey as a secular state from Mustafa Kemal. Turkey has an official religion called Islam and official sect called Sunni. There are 20 million Alevis. Yazidis, Kurdish people lives there, Christians lives there, and you call this state as a secular state, and 500,000 Kurdish village destroyed or evacuated, and Kurdish people still deprived from their basic rights. They don't have education rights in Kurdish. They don't establish any institutions or parties under Kurdish
I wonder if I could turn this into a question about British foreign policy.
No.
I mean, you might, but I mean, is there something we can?
Not quite.
No. There are human rights issues in Turkey, and there are some ethnic problems in Turkey. Is it not going to play important? It is not important to British policy, foreign policy.
Well, you were asking a soldier.
No, I am asking you. You just said, secularism.
No, I admire Turkey hugely for its history over nearly the last century. I admire Kemal Atatürk for what he did for your country. There are currents which run underneath all of that, but I've said what I've said. If Turkey meets the requirements for EU membership, then I would not in any way say no, but I'm not quite sure what your question is.
Well, should we turn our back on the repression of the Kurds? in order...
You're talking about Kurdistan. Forgive me. No, I can't condone that. I can't condone it, but I understand that there are difficulties in territorial integrity here.
The woman at the back.
Personally, if I were the Turkish Prime Minister, I think I'd say to the Kurd, you have Kurdistan. What's the problem?
Can you give us the microphone?
But there we are.
My name's
People
Louise
worry about
Jefferson.
boundaries too much sometimes.
I'm Louise Jefferson, I'm a photographer, and I'm wondering if the British troops are so stretched everywhere else, why there are still close to 7,000 in Northern Ireland, and they're very, very slowly being moved away from Northern Ireland.
Just a convenient place to live, isn't it? Why have we got so many soldiers in Northern Ireland if it's...
Well, we've had soldiers in Northern Ireland on operational duty. Thank you very much. This gives me a very good platform. For 38 years, less a fortnight, in 1 week's time. Hands up, those who know. No, I want an honest show of hands, because I'm astounded by it. That at midnight, a week today, the British Army goes non-operational in Northern Ireland.
We do know.
Well, well, how very revealing. That is what is going to happen. It goes back to the adoption of the joint declaration by both Westminster and Dublin on the 1st of August 2005, the security annex of which said, when adopted, in 2 years' time, this will happen. And you are now a week away from it. So I would go away and think about it and say, how has this come about? It's an extraordinary story. I think it's a huge success. At the end of the day, the original problem was political. The eventual solution had to be political. Clausewitz, straight out of Clausewitz. But what the police and the army had to do was to hold the ring sufficiently for the politics to come good. And so I find it a quite remarkable and something which personally to me means a great deal.
It's a huge achievement. The question is, why do we still need 7,000 troops there, given the success?
But you won't need 7,000 troops there in the sense that you mean it. But the army has a policy of stationing its troops throughout the United Kingdom to maintain, as it's called, our footprint amongst general society. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. But those soldiers, 8,000 of them, who at the moment, for another week, are ring-fenced to operational support of the police service of Northern Ireland, will become general-purpose troops and will be able to be deployed wherever we need them. And that will relieve the present pressure
just to clarify the
considerably.
Point, I mean, I agree with what Mike has said. If we have an army which is, what, 115, 120,000 strong?
Total army, trained army is 100.
Yeah.
Let's
say over 100,000. It's not unreasonable that 7,000 of them should be, in peacetime, based in Northern Ireland, just as many are based in Scotland or Wales or England. How they're used, whether they're deployed elsewhere for particular purposes, is a quite separate issue.
The man here with the...
Can I add, because I also get some ridiculous questions, well, why do we still have 22,000 troops in Germany? Because there's nowhere else to put them, is the answer. It's got damn all to do with keeping the Russians out. Well, I hope forever, but, you know. But you can either have an army which is a quarter smaller overnight by getting rid of them, or you can spend a great deal of money by building barracks on mainland Britain and training areas, or you continue with what actually is quite a good deal.
Thank you. My name is Fuad Majdalawi. I'm going to just try to raise up the heat a bit of the discussion, if I may. First of all, I have to say that I'm a Palestinian Muslim British person, I consider myself. The question that I have for the panel to start with is, I'm not convinced that this country has a foreign policy. That's what brought me to this discussion in the first place. Because every time that a foreign policy decision needs to be made, it's primarily dictated by what Washington says, and then somehow it's interpreted in the United Kingdom. But no foreign policy decision starts in the United Kingdom. It hasn't for a long time, certainly not as far as the Middle East is concerned. The other question that I have for the a Labour Party member, and sorry, I don't know the name, but the question is, you've mentioned that we have tried to put, or the Labour Party has tried to put human rights as a guiding principle to its foreign policy. I say you have failed considerably, given last year's Israel-Lebanon war. For over a month, this country hasn't even dared to even call for a stop of a cessation of fire, and how can that be foreign policy?
We've got the point. We haven't talked about Israel-Palestine at all this evening, but of course it's going to be sorted out now that Tony Blair is focused on something else. Andrew.
Well, I guess one general point and then a specific point. If our policy is the same on some issues as the Americans, that doesn't mean that it was dictated to us from Washington. But as a matter of fact, in the case of Israel-Palestine, I think that what you say isn't true, or not fair, or not completely true. Because whilst many of us might think Tony Blair didn't get much in return for his support for much of George Bush's foreign policy, he did, it seems, encourage George Bush to talk publicly about a two-state solution, a Palestinian state, more than he would have done otherwise. And today, actually, the Litvinenko thing wasn't David Miliband's really his first act as Foreign Secretary. I believe his first act, I think it was his first act, was to talk quite warmly, relatively warmly, about Hamas in relation to the freeing of Alan Johnson. And I think I would be surprised if that tone didn't continue. So I just don't think it's true that in the case of Israel-Palestine, Britain doesn't have an independent foreign policy, even if it has historically sometimes reflected America's.
Gisela, a specific point asked you about the Labour Party and whether it has any foreign policy that's independent at all worthy of the name.
I mean, the mistake we tend to make is that we reckon every problem that comes across the globe, that there's one universal answer to this. And I think you made that point about you really need to take it by case. I mean, in Kosovo, we dragged the Americans in, by the way. Yeah. And I'm very glad that we did. We intervened in Sierra Leone, and because it was successful, nobody talks about it. If you go into the southern Lebanon, you will find that one of the most massive mine clearing that is going on, which is actually in the sense scuppering what the Israelis were trying to do, is actually led by the British. So I think can we just have a touch of fairness here? It's one of the phrases which irritates me because they're so lazy of saying, you know, the Brits are the Americans' poodle. It's in the sense that we actually do work together. I'm very glad we work together. And you can't do that. And the other thing you've got to see when there's a problem, you've got to see who the key players are who can actually deliver solutions. Part of the Middle East has been for a long time, you could negotiate, but some of the negotiating partners actually couldn't deliver you any deals. And the America, in a sense, is one of the most key players in the quartet, and anything we can do to get the Americans to engage more in the Middle East, actually I think must be to the good. And if I have a criticism of the Middle East is, where are all the other Arab states? What are they doing? Can we just have a little bit of balance of saying that they've been sitting on their hands for the last 50 years and have done nothing but whinging? So that's my answer to that.
Man at the back here. Sorry, just before you do,
yeah, sure.
Malcolm.
There's three fundamental issues in the Middle East: Israel-Palestine, Iran, and Iraq. On Israel-Palestine, the British government, ever since 1996, and I remember it because I was involved, has called for a Palestinian state. It was only a couple of years ago that George W. Bush committed the United States to that policy. Fundamental difference. On Iran, the British government, along with other European countries, have been calling for dialogue with Iran and have been using the diplomatic means to try to find a solution to the nuclear impasse. The United States has reluctantly come along that route. The reason for your question, sir, is because, not unreasonably, Iraq has so dominated the political debate for the last 5 years. And on that issue, I'm afraid, Gisela, Blair gave the impression, it may not have been the reality, but he gave the impression that Bush decided the policy and he followed. And in that respect, he was different to every previous Labour or Conservative Prime Minister who has had a much more independent view on issues of that kind.
Can I make just one observation for Blair? Let's think of the politics. Domestic politics for the Labour Party. What was easier to accept? That Blair was following Bush, or that Blair actually believed he was right what he was doing?
Both were true.
Yeah, a bit of an echo there.
far from being.
faith.
What you do after in Lebanon, for example, clearing the mines, of course, thank us for doing that. That's not policy. My question is, what is our policy? Sorry,
Mike.
I'm sorry. If you find that a British government, and I'm trying to diffuse any party political, a British government comes to the view that its strategic interests are largely on common ground with the strategic interests of the United States, then the behavior is entirely explicable. But it is an independent judgment. There is a subset which muddies the waters, that part of, as I try to reflect, part of any consideration of British foreign policy will be the question of the relationship with the United States and the relationship with Europe and how this plays.
Yeah, I mean, Tony.
But to say, we just do what Washington do is nonsensical.
Tony Blair's first speech after 9/11 mentioned Iraq in very much the same way the Americans did. Right at the back here.
My name's Timothy Less. I'd be interested to know what the panel sees as the role of the Foreign Office in foreign policy, and I ask that with a nod to the title of this event, Brown's Foreign Policy rather than Miliband's.
Gisela, you talked about the Foreign Office and it being stronger now than it was before. Is it really?
Well, no, I think it's the chance for the Foreign Office to actually assert itself as a great office of state. Because there's one argument where you could actually say, in the modern world, when we go to war, it is the Secretary of State for Defence, and it is number 10. If it comes to trade, you could say, well, it's whatever the success of DTI is, you do the overseas business. Europe actually shouldn't be in the Foreign Office anymore. Visas and passports and Brits stranded overseas, you should put into the Home Office. What is the role of the Foreign Office other than providing a pool of people who come to the civil service who are trained and expect to be living abroad?
But given if you've got Gordon Brown putting into the Foreign Office the only genuine contender for the leader of the Labour Party in the next generation, what's he telling us?
Which is why exactly I said that's the chance for the Foreign Office to reverse that and say we do provide a role, we do provide the experience. I mean, I'll just give you one example. If you go to Islamabad and you talk to who was then our ambassador, Lyle Grant, and this guy said his grandparents got married in Allahabad, and he has kind of experience and conversations with people there which your money could even buy you an understanding. And the Foreign Office has got that kind of pool. And I very much hope that David Miliband under Gordon Brown recaptures from Downing Street a lot of that foreign policy initiative and their advice and makes it the great office of state it ought to be.
I must say, when I go around the world and visit British embassies and you see the size of the DFID part of the embassy, particularly in conflict areas, you really do see foreign policy governed by quite other criteria as have been governed before. And actually, I would say, for all the right reasons, Afghanistan now, in security terms, is a disaster because international development has failed over the last 5 years. But would you...
Discuss.
Well, watch my news nights over the last year. There've been 3. It's conflict caused by a failure of international development.
I'm not going to let that go. That may be your judgment, but we've got a long way to go. And if you keep saying that, and it becomes the wish is the thought is etc. But just one point to illustrate, I think, where some of these difficulties lie. Tony Blair at the Bonn conference in the aftermath of 2001 9/11 put his hand up and said, when various nations are asked to take leads in functions of government in Afghanistan, we'll do counter-narcotics. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, how kind. And we had, certainly last summer, I think it got a bit better, but last summer, some slightly evangelical ladies and gentlemen tagged to the Foreign Office who thought getting rid of poppies was absolutely what it's all about. And a whole lot of soldiers who were having to deal operations amongst the people, amongst peasant farmers whose livelihood it was to grow poppies. That is what I mean about we don't do strategy.
Right at the back, we're sort of coming towards the end, and
Afshan Ratansi, very quickly, Andrew, it's the one-state solution that's being talked about in the Middle East. I hope The Economist under your editorship is going to evade that reverse barometer reputation it had, fall of the wall, Cuba, Yugoslavia. But to Mike, you were talking about nuclear with the climate change thing. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed said he was going to hit a nuclear power station, and it was apparently Osama bin Laden who stopped him from hitting a nuclear power station. Why are you for it? Also, Sir Richard Dannett said that British troops...
Can we stick on that one?
Well, just quickly, the Sir Richard Dannett one, though. Would you, when you were head of the armed forces, when they were in theatre, ever say they were counterproductive?
Sorry, what was counterproductive?
General Sir Richard Dannett saying that troops in Iraq...
You're asking me to criticise my successor, and I won't do it.
Fair enough.
I'm very happy criticising my successor.
Different game, Malcolm. Different game.
I'm not playing tokenism, but the last 6 questions have been asked by men. There's a woman there. Sorry.
Gordon Brown's been talking a lot recently about hearts and minds. Does anybody know what it means? He talks about it in terms of the Cold War. I mean, was hearts and minds really, was that what the Cold War was really about, in terms of winning the war? And could you explain what you think it means and what, what his strategy is?
Well, this goes back to Malaya, doesn't it? Andrew.
I think the war, we mustn't say war on terror anymore, and we probably never should have done in the first place, but the confrontation with fanatical Islamism is not really analogous to any other struggle in British history. But I think in fairness to Gordon Brown, I would say that it's more analogous to the Cold War than it is to for example, the Second World War, which has been the sort of analogy of choice amongst Anglo-American politicians, insofar as it's going to be a very long duration and it's going to involve confrontation in lots of different parts of the world in lots of different ways. So if that's what he means by it being like the Cold War, then I think he's more right than other people have been.
It's going to involve joined-up thinking of a sort we've not seen before either. Gisela?
Actually, the analogy of this hearts and minds looked to the 1960s and early 70s. You had kind of Red Army faction, you had a lot of kind of terrorism which was against the establishment. And there have been some rather interesting analysis of where the British-born Islamic bombers were, to what extent was it kind of alienation of a generation that no longer agreed with its own parents' values and was living in an environment in which it didn't agree with values and was trying to search for its own. And I think that's something Gordon Brown is acutely aware of, that kind of the enemy which is not defined other than it's just the others, that you have to win over on an irrational level almost. You have to win them over by this persuasion.
We're moving towards what it might be the last couple of questions. Kate, is there a...
Hearts and minds at some stage.
But perhaps we can have a round. Just should we have a couple of questions and then a last thought from the panel?
Kate Clark, I'm a freelance reporter. Let's just come back to Afghanistan. The ambassador there is thinking we're going to be there for another 15 years. Are our soldiers going to be there in, say, 5 years' time, 10 years' time? Will they still be fighting, or will, as the Afghan opposition believe, we will have got bored with Afghanistan by then?
Anyone got one other burning question that can go with that? Yeah. Sorry, I'm running around the room. How long is the forces going to be in Afghanistan?
James Harrington. I'd like to ask a question based on the likelihood that we're likely to have a American president in the near future that will have isolationist policies, such as you have Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama talking about withdrawing from Iraq immediately and talking on the lines of isolation from the rest of the world. I don't know how likely that would be, but what position would that put British foreign policy?
Potential isolation moving from Washington, and at the same time, how long are our forces really going to be in Afghanistan for? From that end of the panel, and if you have any other closing burning thoughts, now's the time.
Well, indeed. I'm going to start with hearts and minds, because I don't think the Cold War was about hearts and minds at all. it was about economic power, and eventually it was not for the Russians themselves, but certainly for the East Europeans, it was a disbelief in the ideology which they had been served up with. One can debate perhaps the end of the Cold War forever, but it's not what hearts and minds means, certainly to the military. That started from the Malayan campaign, where we tried, and I think successfully, as history generally, I think, accepts, trod a careful line between the application of force in a precise way and also the application, if you like, of psychology to the vast majority of the people who did not want a violent present or indeed a violent future, and it worked very well. So I think we need to be careful about how we use that phrase, hearts and minds. It is this phrase I used earlier on, operations amongst the people, where you're trying to tell them the battleground is not some hill or a river crossing. The battleground is people's minds and attitudes and perceptions. And you're trying to tell them, you're trying to persuade them, because you really believe it yourself, that we can offer you a better future than the miserable past you've had. We can do better if we get it right. Afghanistan, well, on that note, you can't achieve that overnight or even over a year. Our strategic interests in Afghanistan, to me, are fundamental. We have to stay the course.
So, Malcolm, isolationist White House, we haven't touched on there. Perhaps you could...
Two points. First of all, on that particular question, I don't think there's the slightest possibility of any future American president being isolationist. America is not involved in the world in order to do the world a favor. It is involved in the world because it's in the United States' own national interest to be involved. Now, if they are defeated, as seems very likely, and to some extent humiliated because of the failure of Iraq, that will create a period of intense soul-searching. It will involve a lot of deep consideration as to where America went wrong. But the United States can't withdraw from the world because it has real raw power, and it is simply not conceived. We're not talking about in America like 100 years ago. On the question of Afghanistan, it seems to me we've forgotten why we originally went to Afghanistan. We did not go to Afghanistan to eradicate poppy fields. We did not go to Afghanistan to provide democracy for the people of Afghanistan, highly desirable though that would be. We did not even go to Afghanistan in order to give good government and create peace and friendship and eternal harmony. We went to Afghanistan for one reason and one reason only, to make sure that Al-Qaeda or an organization like Al-Qaeda could never be given sanctuary in Afghanistan and enabled to train, to prepare for acts of international terrorism using Afghanistan as a secure base. Now, if we remember that, then we have to have more modest aspirations now. And it seems to me that even if, as is highly likely, we are not going to be able to eradicate every last Taliban soldier, and even if we will not get complete control of Helmand, that is not the end of the world. If we are able to confine the vast bulk of Taliban into the frontier area, if we are able to prevent the Taliban having any chance of becoming again the Afghan government, which is not difficult, because in order to actually advance on Kabul, they have to use conventional military means, and there we can destroy them very easily, both by air power and on the ground. So if we are able to achieve these objectives, we achieve the fundamental international objective that Afghanistan cannot be used as a base for international terrorism. It's not an ideal outcome, it's not the one we ideally would like, but it actually serves our international requirements, and at the end of the day, it's for the Afghan people, not for us, to work out what happens to the internal politics of that country.
And that is strategy.
That is strategy.
And it costs in blood and treasure, and we just have to understand that.
Gisa, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, because it's not as simple as you make it out to be, Malcolm. 250,000 people every day move between the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. If you really go to where the real terrorist problems are, it is on that border region which is moving backwards and forwards. So we may have Afghanistan which is no longer a basis and actually just moved it over to the border into Pakistan and made that place.
Well, that takes it in Pakistan. What do we do about Pakistan?
So, but it comes back to something which I thought we shouldn't lose sight of, which was early on, and you apologised, Mike, for making these comments about the rule of law. Actually, if there's got to be something which in any kind of intervention when Britain goes, and it says that is the legacy which we seek to leave, And even if, you know, some people say liberal democracies are something, an aspiration which you can't say, all what we're talking about, all foreign policy, even on the environment, whether it's carbon trading or anything you name, none of these things work if the countries we deal with or the institutions we deal with don't believe in the rule of law. And I think the bottom line would have to be, and to me the success of a place like Afghanistan actually would be, that you end up with a system which complies with rule of law, compliance with the rule of law. And I think in that sense, Tony Blair actually was quite believed in something. To him, that was incredibly important. And we shouldn't lose sight, and I think particularly the liberal left, who believes that sometimes intervention is justified in the interest of human rights, should not, because of Iraq, now just stand there and wring its hands and keep saying, oh, well, terrible things are happening in Darfur, terrible things are happening in Zimbabwe, terrible things are happening all over the place, but we're not going to do anything. We must have a parameter by which we do say intervention is justified, and it must be A, human rights, and B, the outcome is a compliance with the rule of law.
Andrew, having got stuck into these things, do you think this government has the stomach to stay with them?
Which things?
Well, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, actually, you know, I'd like to. I tell you what. I'd like to answer the question. I'd like to mention the next thing, and in relation to the question about American isolationism, which is the thing, the one, well, one of many big things we haven't talked about there, which is Iran, which I think is going to be the next big thing. And I think it's actually germane to many of the issues we've been talking about. And one of them is, you know, events and their ability to disrupt best laid plans of incoming prime ministers, as Iran may yet do for Gordon Brown. And another is the independence or otherwise of British foreign policy, because actually, if you talk to British diplomats about the role Britain and with its two European partners, France and Germany, are playing in Iran, it's a role of double restraint. Partly it's restraining the Iranians, and partly it's restraining the Americans by hoping that a sanctions regime will achieve their desired end. So I think, you know, that's an example. That's something that we have to think about looking forward. But it's an example of how Britain can play a hopefully benign and semi-independent role in foreign affairs.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. The two politicians have to absurdly go away and
vote against each other.
And we can't persuade them to stay and
you can persuade us, but you can't persuade the whips.
This conversation will continue.
Can't you pair?
In a logical world, that's what
this conversation will continue downstairs in the bar, where my book, Frontline, and a rollicking read about war reporting is on sale. Thank you very much to Andrew Miller, political editor of The Economist. General Sir Mike Jackson, his book comes out in a couple of months' time. Jason Stewart, member of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, and Sir Malcolm Rifkind, local Tory MP almost.